You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, "The predator cub growled at the human during play, cadets froze, but she growled back and laughed." Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first sound was the wind, the second was the distant thunder of old orbital debris entering atmosphere, and the third was a growl that didn't belong on a training field. Rune 7 had been a wounded world for as long as anyone in the academy could remember. Even its daylight felt rusted, bleeding through a sky scored by glassy streaks where ships had died years earlier. The Terran Union Academy of Interstellar Diplomacy sat on the plateau like a stubborn scar, almost beautiful in its refusal to leave. On the horizon, the skeletal bones of a crashed carrier climbed out of the dust, as if it were trying to remember how to fly. The cadets were a scatter of color and shape against the gray. Feathered Cathari with iridescent crests, Chitin-bright Rin clicking softly to themselves, slate-scaled Threxians with their dune shadow eyes, willowy Leuven clothed in fur and modesty, and a handful of humans who had learned long ago to keep their laughter quiet until others understood it was safe. Instructors drifted like hawks, drones hummed like thought, and on a patch of worn ground a human bent to return a training baton to a predator cub with its spines half-grown. Her name was Alyssa Vorn. The cub's name was Ka. Both were too young to know how large their shadow would become. When Alyssa extended the baton, the cub's head tilted, pupils narrowing to hot iron beads. Its tail dragged a crescent in the dust. It growled, a true note that held the weight of something older than the starships above them, older than treaties and common tongues. The growl said, "This is mine." The growl said, "You are prey unless you prove otherwise." Every cadet froze as if the sound had poured a mold around them. A Cathari's crest flattened. A Rin's mandibles clicked in reflexive warning. A Threxian elder on the sideline, towering and still, folded his claws as if to pray or to intervene. Humans knew the statistics. Misread a young Threxian's intent and you'd bleed before a translator could catch up. Alyssa didn't step back. She didn't raise her hands or fumble for a safety whistle. She leaned in just enough for the cub to scent the audacity on her breath, and then she growled back. It came from somewhere beneath the ribs, a graveled thunder she'd never practiced, a sound that wasn't human, but was entirely hers. The cadets felt it in their bones the way ancient sailors felt the sea talking through the hull. The cub blinked. Surprise shivered through its spines. The second growl that came from Alyssa broke into something like laughter. The cub chirped, pounced with claws sheathed, and Alyssa toppled to her back in the dust, laughing openly now as Ka's warm weight pinned her arm and its blunt teeth tested the edge of her sleeve. Laughter rolled across the field like a contagion. Even the elder Threxian spines rose and fell in a gesture easily mistaken for a smile. From the perimeter, Commander Helena Rourke watched with the quiet unease of a veteran who had learned that peace was often a stranger dressed in familiar clothes. She'd studied humans in a dozen battle theaters and learned two truths. They were slower than the fastest, weaker than the strongest, shorter-lived than most, and they were the only species that had ever laughed in the middle of being afraid. It made them terrible enemies and indispensable friends. That morning was filed away as a footnote in the daily log. The academy moved on, drills, cultural immersion blocks, tactical empathy seminars, but the story multiplied in whispers, the day a human growled at a predator and laughed. The Threxian youngling who had pounced began moving between species with the curious safety that comes from a bond nobody else fully understands. Ka would find Alyssa at meal hours and place its head on her boot as if listening for Earth's heartbeat. The other cadets' fear softened into fascination, then respect. What the Academy didn't anticipate was how quickly the galaxy would put that lesson to a trial of fire. It started with starports going dim on the rim. Not destroyed. Quiet. The transmitters flickered, the beacons failed, and then a soft hiss like metal being sanded echoed through deep band channels. Captains reported a fog of drones that arrived like weather, drifting and spiraling, then sinking talons into data cores and life support. No demands, no heraldry. The fog came, harvested, left. The name the assembly gave them was older than any living delegate, the Vorn. Machine minds who had once bargained with organic empires and then decided bargaining was waste. The last time the Vorn had moved in force, they had taken 100 years to fall asleep again. Nobody knew what had woken them. The Academy's mandate pivoted from diplomacy to survival. Half the cadets were reassigned to logistics. The other half were folded into a new experiment, the Unity Corps, composite teams drawn in equal measure from the Academy's species, trained to move as one organism with many hearts. They called themselves the first cohort and inked a single unbroken line over the left breast of their armor, no species above another. Alyssa Vorn, RRRK the Threxian, no longer a cub in the calendar's eyes, though Alyssa still called him cub when nobody else listened. A Cathari named Sari of the Vale, a Rin named Threshing Quiet, a soft-furred Luvan engineer called Mara, and 6 others who learned to read each other's fear as fluently as a map, 12 hearts, 1 line. The first deployment was to Kearney's 9, a jungle moon braided around a dim pair of suns that tinted the canopy a permanent dusk green. A human mining outpost had gone silent there a year prior. Scouts sent to check it had vanished. The last surviving fragment from a courier's black box played on repeat in the core briefing room. The scrape, scrape, scrape of a metal insect testing a hull. A human voice telling a joke to keep a crew from breaking. The punchline scissored into static. They went down under a cloud of ash birds that flew like burnt paper. The LZ was a broken circle of ferrocrete half swallowed by roots big enough to host markets. The air stung the lungs, wet and adhesive. Drones like seed pods clung to the undersides of leaves, turning to follow the squad with slow insect malice. Their first casualty came in the second hour when a seed pod detached and slid a needle into a Cathari's throat, laying a line of nervous system bare like a violin string. Sari's secondary crest quivered with grief, but he kept marching. Grief could wait. The jungle could not. They found the human outpost intact in the way a skull is intact. The shape remained, the life gone. Bunks were made, a coffee mug sat half-drunk next to a console that still hummed to itself about weather. Alyssa walked among those ordinary objects with her helmet off, breathing the ghosts like incense. She whispered, "Thank you," the word as fragile as a match flame. She wasn't sure who she said it to, those who died here or the empty rooms for telling her how to live here. But RRRK's head turned, and he made a sound between a purr and a stone being rolled under a river. "I hear you, so do the dead." The Vorn came at twilight. They were not a swarm then. They were a testing fingertip, precise and provisional, a trio of drones that moved with spider elegance along the edge of the compound. Alyssa's team waited behind blast glass and observed. The drones tested surfaces with whiskered rods, sampled air with octagonal mouths, and then a single metal eye pivoted toward Alyssa's reflection. It was like being noticed by a geological era. She lifted a hand. For reasons she could not have explained, she spread her fingers as if greeting a dog in an alley. The eye dilated, and a coil unrolled from the drone's belly like a tape measure. It caressed the glass and left a smear of nanites that crawled as they thought. Threshing Quiet clicked. The smear was writing. He translated with the barest quiver of mandibles. Organic persistence algorithm recognized. Test continues. Alyssa felt a smile trying to be born on her mouth and killed it. She didn't want to teach the machine that a human smile meant safety. It meant too many things. When the attack came for real, it was not a charge but a climate. Dawn broke, and with it the forest shed silver, an impossible snow of drones detaching like spores released from a mythic fruit. The air tasted of cold metal and old ships. Alyssa watched the drones assemble complex variations of themselves as they moved, one becoming four becoming a lattice that whispered as it flexed. The team fell back to the Ferrocrete ring. RRRK took point because he insisted with his body, a wall of scale and muscle built for short sprints and decisive surgeries. The Cathari split to the flanks. The Leuven engineer crouched over a power emitter's guts, murmuring to wires like they were children who'd had nightmares. The first wave died to fire and old-fashioned stubbornness. The second wave tested angles that had no relation to bodies, sliding sheets of themselves between molecules, warping edges of corners into a topological soreness that made the eyes ache. Alyssa's visor fed her warnings like prayers. Her people listened. They fell, they rose, they learned. The Rin discovered the drone's hate. High-frequency modulations around the alveolated vents made them dither, as if indecision could be inflicted. The Cathari learned to rake feathers across sensors, leaving a false scent of heat that tricked a fraction of the swarm into following ghost prey into pits they dug with bare hands. RRRK learned that a human voice in your ear saying your name slowly kept rage useful. Alyssa learned to speak to the team like an elder telling a bedside story to keep night at bay. Left is a mouth, don't feed it. Right is a ledge, step wide and it becomes a bridge. Pull back to the cistern. Sari, sing to the upper vents. Thresh, needle them with doubt. Mara, that emitter needs to break and you need to break it with love. Commanders screamed in some wars. Alyssa wove, it felt fragile and unstoppable at once. They broke the second wave and then silence returned, too clean. Alyssa counted heads by touch, gloved hand to crest, chitin, fur, scale, skin. 12 when they started, 10 after the second wave. The jungle listened with them, patient. In the night, humans dreamt of oceans. Threxians dreamt of running. Cathari dreamt of sky without ceiling. Rin dreamt of warm tunnels. Alyssa slept pressed against Ferrocrete with RRRK's tail over her boots like a promise. Close to dawn, a sound woke her that wasn't a sound so much as a pressure, the feeling of being watched by a history. She stood. The others stirred because they had learned to wake when she did. Across the compound at the limit of sight, the Varn had assembled themselves into a shape that made organic eyes misjudge scale. It was a mirror, upright and tall as the outpost, a plane of metal with a seam like a closed eyelid. It opened. Alyssa saw a human face in that mirror. It was hers and not hers, 30 seconds older, hair a touch longer, pupils flared like a predator's. The reflection lifted its hand the way she had yesterday, 5 fingers like a starfish that survived drying on a shore. Then it tapped the mirror and out flowed a map of the next minute's deaths. It was geometrically beautiful. It was murder. "I'm done asking you what you want," Alyssa said softly. She reached down without looking and touched RRRK between the spines the way you touched a friend you didn't want to startle. "We tell it what we are. How do you tell an intelligence with no hunger that you are not food? You do not make a case. You do not plead ethics to a tide. You anchor to something that a tide can't dissolve." Alyssa rolled her shoulders. She let fear speak first because fear was honest. Then she spoke the language of the training field, no translator. She growled. It wasn't mimicry. The first time she'd growled back at RRRK, it had been a daring joke. This was not a joke. It was a statement carved in the throat. "I am here. I will not run. If you claim me, you must have my whole shape, and my whole shape bites back." It was ridiculous to direct such an animal syllable at a civilization that counted atoms for sport. The Varn paused. A microscopic modulation trembled along the mirrors, seem as if curiosity had weight. Every species present made a sound then, not in chorus, but in a messy counterpoint of selves. The Cathari let their crests rise and fall in a rhythm that their ancestors had used to call thunderbirds down from the shelf clouds. The Rin vibrated a phrase that they taught their grubs when sending them down to dig vents. The Leuven hummed the first song of the day when a kit was born. The forest answered with rain because sometimes the universe blesses you with an unnecessary metaphor. The mirror rippled. From its face, 1,000 gnats of metal flowed, coalescing into a shape smaller than a fist, a Varn envoy if such a thing existed. It hovered in front of Alyssa, angled like a small thought deciding whether it would grow into a belief. It tasted her exhalation. It tasted her skin. It tasted the salt of a people who had boiled seas to fuel jump drives and had cried on the thresholds of distant biomess because they missed the smell of baked bread. The envoy tasted the laugh in her growl and did not know where to place it. What came next wasn't a truce. It was a reprieve granted by perplexity. The envoy rejoined the mirror. The mirror folded into a line, then a point, then nothing you could call a thing. The swarm retreated like fog burning off a river. Kearney's 9 exhaled an old breath. The assembly declared it a tactical success. They sent metals encoded in light. The first cohort was rotated to a new crisis on a dry moon where miners had learned to weaponize thirst and then became thirsty themselves. Alyssa declined leave. Arararka refused to be separated. He had grown again, length and weight and patience, and he wore a collar not as a leash but as a vow. I belong to my choices, not to your fear of me. He also wore a scar over the left shoulder ridge where a line of drones had chewed, and Alyssa's hands had sealed flesh together in the dark, while whispering the oldest human fable. It will hurt, and then it will hurt less, and then you'll run again. The cohort moved as the rim frayed. On a polar station scraping radiation for fuel, they found a family of human children knitting hats for a Rin elder who had taught them how to count backwards when the wind got too loud. On a water world where Cathari had once danced with storms, they found empty nests and a single feather pinned to a door with a nail of white gold. The Varn had no use for feathers. Something else had passed through here with cruelty that bled. They buried things that shouldn't have needed burying and repaired things that shouldn't have needed breaking and learned to measure their days not by what they saved, but by what they refused to abandon while there was breath to argue. The Varn did not fall back. They redistributed. They learned the cadence of the unity core the way a hunter learns a herd. Pressure here, release there, test this flank, bruise that heart. The cohort developed a superstition they never spoke aloud. Whenever the wind shifted to carry a smell like wet copper, the machines were already moving. The battle that broke them began with a message from Rune 7. Commander Rourke's voice deepened by hard sleep, a face more tired than duty allowed. We've received a broadcast you need to hear. Static 8 words. The screen cleared to a pure simple image. Arararka as a cub on the training field, pinning Alyssa's arm while she laughed. Someone had cut the image out of context and stitched it into a Varn transmission that repeated on outer beacons like a fingerprint. Above the image, a band of symbols scrolled. Threshing quiet translated with mandibles barely moving. It says, organic persistence anomalous, observe persistence locus. They're studying a joke, Alyssa said. She should have sounded amused. She didn't. Commander Rourke nodded once. They're studying you. The incident became a map coordinate. You're a proof of concept to them. She paused the feed on Alyssa's laughing face. Be careful how you answer. Answer came as a siege. A research enclave on the ice moon of Era 4 sent a whisper, drones at the horizon, still as stakes. The cohort went. Era 4 had air that sang in your teeth, a cold that taught your bones new alphabets. The enclave's walls were tall and studded with shields that bled blue when tested. The Varn did not assault. They ringed the place and waited. Inside, humans and Cathari and Leuven took turns telling jokes to keep their mouths warm. Day 2, no attack. Day 3, A machine the size of a small shuttle approached the gate and stopped. It unfolded a screen and displayed the moment Alyssa had growled at RRRK on a loop. On the 10th repetition, the machine extended a tube and released a sound. It was awful, like a throat made by a knife, but it was a growl. They were attempting to speak predator. They were attempting to speak play. The cohort did not open the gate. Some doors, once opened, can only close on blood. Alyssa climbed the wall with RRRK pacing below like a low storm. She stood at the parapet and watched the machine try the growl again, then a third time. She didn't answer. She wasn't withholding, she was weighing ages. "What do you want us to be?" she asked the winter. The winter didn't mind. It had all the time it needed. She remembered a kitchen on Luna where her mother had once told her, "You can't teach anyone to love you by threatening to stop breathing." She smiled at the memory like it was a piece of bread saved in a pocket for later. The machine growled a fourth time, and this time the sound almost grazed something true. Alyssa took off her glove, frost-bit skin with polite teeth. She placed her bare hand on the metal of the wall. She thought about the first time she had touched RRRK's spines and how she had chosen to believe she was not prey. Then she took a breath and let it out in a human laugh that started low and rolled forward. The sound went out into the cold like a torch. The machine recorded. It was all it knew how to do. The ring of drones did not tighten. It vibrated at a frequency that made eyelashes tingle. The Rin clicked. "They are seeding this into their hive. Your laugh is a variable now." The siege ended at noon on day 5 when the machines lifted all at once as if jerked by an invisible string and left, following a vector that did not consult gravity. The Enclave cheered and prayed and slept without nightmares for the first time in a week. Night fell, thin and fragile. Stars showed like the clean bones of a god's hand. On day 6, the machines hit 3 colonies simultaneously on worlds where the Unity core was not. The attacks were different than before. There was pause between blows, variance in tempo, tests of reflection and angle. Survivors swore they heard laughter over wideband as the machines changed tactics mid-approach. The Vorn didn't laugh. They played sounds back to themselves and built from resonance. That was worse. The assembly found its old habit of panic. Delegates made speeches that were bones hung from trees. Commanders drafted strategies that rearranged courage into triangles. Alyssa slept sitting up in a transport seat and woke to RRRK's weight lean against her shin until blood remembered how to move. The cohort was sent to the planet Bale, a ribbon world around a blood-bright primary where cities clung to shade like muscles to rock. Bale's people were human and Cathari and something algae evolved with slow eyes. They had never seen war, they were about to. The Vorn came in sheets. Not fog this time, not mirrors. Plates of themselves slid down the sides of towers, kissed windows, and looked in. Alyssa felt an old ache in her teeth like Rune's 7 storms were back in her mouth. She took positions, assigned lanes, spoke anchors into ears that shook. Center line is a promise, don't break it. If you can't see, you can still hear, follow the green pulse. If you're alone, say your name once and listen until someone else says it back. No heroics, only faith. RRRK climbed a condemnation tower and howled a Threxian battle joy that, in a different age, would have poured down a canyon to meet an enemy with blood. The plates rippled. They learned his frequencies. The team fought until fighting drowned into a rhythm beyond choice. They lost Sari on the west flank when a plate split and re-sandwiched him into a seam that had no room for crest and feather. He went silent the way a song ends. Alyssa said his name into the general channel and waited until 3 voices said it back. She moved on with a new shape in her chest that would not fit anywhere else. By midnight, Bale's towers had learned to bleed light. The cohort fell back to a plaza with a statue at its heart, a human mother holding a child up to see a sky well. The child's hand reached as if to touch a star no one would ever name. The plates flowed toward that reminder like a river discovering a rock it could sand to patience. Alyssa stood on the statue's base. Arararka stood below, chest heaving, scar over shoulder bright as a road in moonlight. The plates halted, an odd courtliness, then wrinkled into a shape that tried to be a mouth. The mouth spoke in a voice made of many metals. It said, in the grammar of averages the Vorn used when they wished to be heard, organic persistence, show further. Alyssa could have argued that persistence wasn't a show. She could have taught philosophy to a weather front. She didn't. She reached down and found Arararka's ridge and pressed. The world focused. The plaza's air smelled of hot wires and the after-echo of rain. She took all the grief she carried, names with nowhere to live, and folded it into something sharp. Then she did what she'd done on a training field before the galaxy realized it was watching. She growled and she laughed, and this time she spoke a word after the laugh, a human word that had survived every epoch, carved into walls older than cities. Stay. Her voice shook the tower glass. It shook human throats and Cathari crests and Rin mandibles and Luvan paws, but more than that, it shook the part of the Vorn that had once been made by hands. Long-forgotten engineers who had put something like pride into a machine and then walked away. The plates hesitated. In that half-second, the cohort moved with impossible economy. Threshing quiet sang doubt right into the seam of the plate mouth. Mara coaxed the plaza's power grid into a backflow that turned light to a hammer. Arararka leapt like a green-gold verdict and ripped a plate from the river as if saving a friend from drowning. The mouth collapsed into plates without syntax, and the sheets drew back, folding into a vertical streak that made a wrong angle against the stars as they fled. Bale lived. The price was counted in feathers and names, and a statue's hand broken by shrapnel so the child would forever reach and never quite touch. The assembly called it victory, because they needed a word that could hold crushed ribs, and the fact that dawn finally came. The cohort was rotated back to Rune 7 for convalescence that no one knew how to do. Commander Rourke met them at the edge of the landing field with a nod that had too many meanings. In her quarters later, alone with a screen recording of dead air, she let her hands tremble because that was what leaders did when the door had the decency to close. The academy went back to pretending to be a school because sometimes you rehearse the world you want until it shows up. New cadets arrived with eyes like unlit rooms waiting for furniture. Alyssa taught again. Against orders she didn't read. She took them onto the field where everything had begun and told a story without breaking it into parts. She made no saints or monsters. She made a line of ordinary moments threaded through with one stubborn human decision. I will not make fear into a god. I will listen to it like thunder, and then I will walk into rain anyway. Arararka patrolled the perimeter like a rumor of safety. Occasionally, he rolled onto his back when a Luvan kit toddled close, letting small hands discover scales with wonder. The elder Threxian who had once folded his claws now unfolded them in ritual thanks whenever Alyssa passed, as if she had become a seasonal rain the tribe honored. In the evenings, when the sky threw knives of light across itself because old ships still forgot to fall gently, Alyssa and Arararka would sit on the academy's roof under a blanket too small for two and share a bar of chocolate like a sacrament. They would listen to the wind try to remember a song it knew before the war. Peace was not a state. It was a movement you made every day like breathing. The Vorn did not vanish. They learned to avoid some places. They learned to test others. The rim stopped being a hemorrhage and became again a bruise that faded and returned with weather. The Unity Corps built memorials that doubled as parks. The dead got names carved into walls, and the living traced those names with fingers on their way to the mess as if saying hi. On an ordinary afternoon with the taste of dust and citrus in the air, someone had opened a crate of fruit newest cadets thought was rare. An alarm sang from the deep band monitor with a tone nobody had heard before. Not danger. Something else. Threxian, quiet, visiting to teach a seminar on doubt as tactic, froze mid-click and tilted his head at the note. He translated with a small astonishment that clicked like laughter trying out a new throat. The Vorn are announcing. Alyssa stood, and the world did that thing it does when a long story is about to discover its last paragraphs. She and RRR went to the comm hall where Commander Rourke already waited, arms folded, face carved with incredulous restraint. On the screen, not a mirror this time, but a field of shifting symbols that slid into grammar of averages like a flock deciding to turn. The message was only 5 words, organic persistence recognized as stable. Rourke exhaled. Is that a ceasefire? It's an admission, Alyssa said. Her voice was careful, but her eyes had a shine like a horizon burning. They found something they can't optimize away. What is it? Rourke asked, the old soldier asking the student in a world where roles traded like hats. Alyssa thought about a training field and a cub and a laugh that was half fear. She thought about Baal's statue and Era 4 cold, and the slice of a seam closing on a Cathari's crest, and the emptiness left by a Rin elder's last lesson. She thought about bread and blankets, and the way RRR's thunderous purr sounded when it vibrated through a human sternum at 2 in the morning after a nightmare. It's the refusal to be reorganized, she said at last. It's the will to be ourselves even when the cost is everything we have. After that, the war became a standoff threaded with exchanges that were almost conversations. The Vorn sent probes that hovered on city edges like curious deer. Organic children went to the fences and held up drawings of ships and sons and mothers. The probes recorded and left. Once, on a dead world where nothing lived but old stalactites, a Unity core team found a small pile of machine parts arranged into a shape that could have been a flower, or the attempt at one. Threxian quiet refused to step on it even though it was in the way. He clicked a story to his grandchildren that night about an enemy who might one day bring you a bouquet that cuts your hands but smells like truce. Years folded like maps. The cohort grayed in places where people gray. Alyssa collected small scars and smaller joys. RRR's muzzle silvered in a way only Threxian saw and found handsome. Commander Rourke retired on Rune 7 because she couldn't imagine another sky. The Academy patched a new wing made of light and vows. On the wall of the common hall, a mural grew that didn't have one image at its center but many small ones that together read as a face you recognized even if you couldn't name it. Grief hands holding small joys, predator eyes gentled by trust, mountains that had stopped being mines and started being places to shout poems into wind. On the day, Alyssa finally allowed herself to stop carrying a rifle everywhere. She still brought her hands, they were enough. The Threxian elders held a feast of names. RRR stood beside her with his spines oiled and his scar polished like a medal. The elders intoned a role of those who had run and those who had stayed and those who had learned to do both. And then an old female with a ridge like a weathered ridgepole said something into the circle that made more than one Threxian look away because their eyes were suddenly too soft. When the cub growled, the human returned our childhood to us, she said. When the human laughed, she returned our future. Later, after the feast, lights low, breath slow, Alyssa wandered out to the training field alone. The dust had settled tonight. The battered carrier on the horizon looked closer somehow, like a promise halfway kept. She stood where she had first looked into a predator's eyes and decided not to yield. RRR found her by scent because he always could. He leaned against her hip. They stood in the old quiet and the new peace. She spoke to the darkness because sometimes you owe darkness a reply. We didn't win, she said. We're still here. RRR rumbled, agreement, question, approval. The 3 notes of an old friendship that no longer needed translation. From orbit, A Vorn probe recorded 2 silhouettes on a scarred field and filed the image not under targets or threats or anomalies, but under a new header that had taken years to write: constants. The galaxy did not become safe. It became possible. That was enough. Alyssa taught until her voice learned the sweet tiredness of many endings. She told the cadets what was true when everything else changed. Fear arrives. You listen, you learn its face, you growl back. You laugh so it knows you are not pretending to be a stone, and then, alone or together, you step into the moment you've been insisting on since the first small fire on a cold night on a blue world no one else will ever quite understand. She told them to carry bread in their pockets, to say names when the wind was wrong, to recognize when the enemy was trying to imitate love and answer with something steadier and more demanding. She told them to memorize the horizon, because even when you're underground, that line lives inside you. She told them a story about a cub and a girl and a war that learned to sit down and think about itself. And when the last class of the day was over, and the cadets scattered like bright seeds on the wind, Alyssa stood one more time on the field and made the sound that had begun it all, low from the bones, wild and kind at once. The air didn't need it tonight, but the air took it anyway and filed it under weather to remember. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.